Hello. This coming weekend, the 8th Sunday or weekend of the Ordinary Time, and this will bring to a conclusion for a while the celebration, what we call Ordinary, brings to our attention for the first reading a section from the book of Sirach, chapter 27, verses 4 through 7. Again, we're going to look at the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 15, this time verses 54 to 58. And the Gospel of Luke will bring us to chapter 6, verses 39 through 45. Now, in both of these latter cases, we're kind of rounding out some looks that we have been taking at the tradition over the last couple of weeks. For example, Luke in chapter 6, we remember had a couple weeks ago Luke's famous Sermon on the Plain, woes for, blessings for. And then last week, a rather strong message, you remember, about the importance of love, of both, not only simply of those who like you, but also love of those who do not like you. This time, Luke mentions Jesus as saying, I give you a parable. Now, there are going to be a number of parables that are found in Luke's story. In fact, he is perhaps a wonderful storyteller in this regard. As we have pointed out perhaps in the past when we began, that in the Lucan tradition, some of the most famous of the parables of Jesus are remembered. But in this case, when he talks about parables, it's probably better to refer to Jesus as pictured by Luke as issuing parabolic sayings that therefore use, and parables like to use different images and metaphors, and that's what's found in the sayings that we're going to hear this weekend. They follow the material that we've heard, as I mentioned, that we heard last time. A parable, in verse 39, begins, and I'll have to read some of these because they're very short and they do kind of cause us to have to look at things or think of things. Jesus says, "Can a blind man be a guide for another blind person? Will they not both fall into a ditch or into a pit?" Now, one needs to be careful here because indeed in our own time, and even in Jesus' time, it wasn't impossible for those who were afflicted, for example, with blindness, not to be able to lead others. And certainly in our time, we have to be very careful that those who are born or find themselves with certain limited capacities, perhaps being able to see, to be able to hear, to be able to walk, in Jesus' time were sometimes placed on the fringe of society. Were considered, as we've mentioned before, the poor. But we know in our time that blindness is not a prohibition to people being able to lead. We've had some wonderful examples of people who are physically blind doing wonderful and important things, not only in our times recently past, but even in our own times. So it is perhaps important to notice in this parable that the illustration about the blind leading the blind perhaps has much more to do not with physical blindness, but with, say, intellectual or spiritual blindness. So if one is in that sense, and remember that the words of Luke here in this section are most likely directed toward believers in Luke's own community, many of whom, of course, had a background in the Greek culture, or as the Hebrew community would call them, the Gentiles. And so there is also some understanding going on here that would be reflective of the world of the Hellenic culture that Luke is certainly aware of and helping to bring to our attention. Certainly in the gospel as Luke presents it, Though many have seen, and here's what I'm suggesting, seen not simply physically, that is, not being able to have this, but seeing the shepherds, see the angels. Simeon, when Mary and Joseph bring the child Jesus into the temple, see in this child the promised one. And throughout the gospel, there are other illustrations of how this kind of seeing goes on. So I hope to make the point here that this is much more about a faith attitude, being able to see something and to believe something. And that seems to be what this little parable of Jesus has in mind here. So sight being a spiritual understanding much more than simply a physical being able to see, although one cannot dismiss that as certainly part of the larger story as Luke sees it. Verse 40 says this, "A disciple is not above the teacher, but when fully trained, every disciple will be like the teacher." Now again, this is directed toward those who would follow in Jesus' way, and in some ways, important to notice, that those who follow one as a guide are only as good as the guide. But in this case, Jesus, of course, being the model, those who would follow him can also share and hopefully will be able to share and bring that good that Jesus brought into the world also into the world themselves. So that would be verse 40. Verse 41 reads, "Why do you spot the splinter in your brother's eye and not notice the log in your own eye?" Now again, I pause a moment here to say that some of these sayings which Luke puts together here in this little section are also found in the gospel tradition of Matthew and also in a gospel discovered in the mid-1900s called the Gospel of Thomas. We're not talked a lot about this. It's generally believed not to be one of the canonical Gospels, but has many of the sayings, not all of them, but many of the sayings that are also found in Luke and Matthew, which of course also refers to, as we've mentioned before, a so-called common source known as the Q source. So all of this to say that some of these little parable sayings are not unique with Luke, but they're brought into this section of Luke to help kind of flesh out the message that he sees important for his community and for his readers to appreciate. So the idea of something being in another person's eye, again, was not original with Luke. Couple of sayings here. Demosthenes, one of the Greek philosophers, "Better it is to correct one's own fault than those of others." Thales, who wrote about the 6 before the common time, cautioned about the counseling of others. And Dionysius Laius, who wrote the 4th century before the common time, said, "Avoid doing what you find blasphemy in others." So my point is, to kind of put this together, is that this is not necessarily original, but the originality is how it's placed into the teaching of Jesus as Luke sees it. For verse 42 says, just to finish up verse 41, "How can you say to your brother, 'Brother, allow me to extract the splinter from your eye,' when you yourself don't see the log in your eye?" Well, of course, you can see a bit of hyperbole here, and that immediately got everybody's attention, whoever used this. And the truth, of course, is kind of evident too. Isn't it easy to pick out some little error in another person's actions or lives, and how could it be possible that we miss a similar or even worse attitude in our own lives. So the splinter versus the log. In either case, you wouldn't want it in your eye, but you could certainly see how this metaphor is at work here. And then he uses the word hypocrite. You hypocrite, to do this. Now keep in mind that the word hypocrite has to do with the Greek theater. We may have mentioned this before. And the idea that Jesus used a phrase like that, hypocrite meant, you remember, that the actors in the theater of Greece had only two faces. You did not really see the real face of the actor, but they would hold up in front of them when they came out to perform either a face which showed smiling, kindness, or a face which showed anger or hurt. Those were the two faces that you saw, and you really didn't know what the person behind the mask was even looking like or saying. Well, you could know what they were saying, but you couldn't know by looking at them just the expression on their face. So, hypocrite. Was Jesus familiar with the Greek theater? Now, there's an interesting question. We've mentioned before that about 4 miles from the village of Nazareth, where Jesus grew up, was the larger Greek city of Sepphoris, which had been built and then destroyed, and in Jesus' time had been rebuilt by Herod Antipas as one of the centers where he would exercise his rule over the Galilee, of which he was the leader. And archaeologists, of course, have had a wonderful opportunity to uncover much of Sepphoris. It turns out to be quite an interesting and large city for its time. Some of the streets were done with tile, much like and images, faces. One of the most famous picture comes from one of the baths that are there. But my whole point here in Sepphoris is that there was a great theater. And the chances that Jesus, being the son of a carpenter and being a carpenter himself, might have done some work in rebuilding Sepphoris. Sepphoris had been destroyed in the year 6 because of an uprising, and therefore the kind of army had come in and destroyed it. And now it was being rebuilt by Herod Antipas, who in Jesus' own time, by the way, had moved his center of power or control from Sepphoris down to a city that he was building on the Sea of Galilee or the Lake of Gennesareth called Tiberias. And so perhaps when we think of Jesus' own ministry, Herod would have been more there than he was at Sepphoris. Be that as it may, the point about knowing how the term and understanding of the theater worked may well have been part of Jesus' life. Now, I have to smile and say, did Jesus ever go to the theater? Well, you never know, do you? 4 miles away, kind of on an off Sunday. Remember, Sunday was an okay work day. Anyway, so all of that, when he's called a hypocrite, in the gospel generally means you're not acting like your face, or you are hiding behind what is the face that you are holding up. Verse 43 continues. Now notice this is just a series of little parabolitic sayings. A sound tree does not produce rotten fruit, nor does a rotten tree produce good fruit. Each tree, this would be verse 44, is known by its own fruit. People do not harvest figs from brambles or grapes from thorn bushes. So all of that would be, in many ways, very practical reasoning, and people would immediately kind of get that. And so, metaphorically, what is the fruit that we should be bearing as followers of Jesus' way? But the good fruit, And what should we avoid? Well, we should avoid the kind of, if you want, bad fruit. And so you can see another kind of practical image. One of the characteristics of parables, as you remember, is that they are taken from real life, from things that people really were accustomed to or knew, even if they didn't do it regularly themselves. So all of these are little reminders of how the blessings of God and the woes are going to be tricked out in people's lives. Finally, in verse 45, which is the last of the verses this time, it reads, "The good person draws the good deed from the storehouse of the heart, and the wicked person draws evil deeds from wicked storehouse. Each person speaks from the overflow of the heart." So here again, you can see he kind of ends up this little section with an encouragement that the words we give, the deeds that we perform, come from the goodness of our hearts. So all of that, as I say, would appeal certainly to the audience of Luke, who often were much more maybe familiar, say, with the Greek theater, with the Greek Hellenic ways of doing things, than maybe originally some of the contemporaries of Jesus were. Although it's hard to say, because as we have mentioned in the past, the Galilee, that would be the territory in which Jesus lived and taught, had a lot of influence from the Hellenic world because of the trade patterns, trade routes that ran through that area. So all of that may have said that Jesus was much more, I might say today, a Renaissance man, much more aware of different cultures than his own, than we might suspect. So those are the kind of little sayings, and in the end, it hopes that the trait that one would find, and here is the kind of important conclusion to this, is may the character of each believer of Jesus be one who is not quite so judgmental of others as we heard, the speck in the eye, that is more willing to bring goodness into one's action, that is not to be a hypocrite, but to truly let the face of goodness shine, and of course, let the good fruit, the good works, be those that come from the good heart of the believer. So all of that in this concluding chapter 6 of Luke's story. With that in mind, and perhaps that's why the first reading, which is chosen from the book of Sirach, a work written, well, maybe about 150, 200 years prior to Jesus' time, a collection of sayings that were intended to help, particularly, we believe, young men who were interested in perhaps having some kind of leadership role in their communities, and this would be helpful. And so what one finds from the book of Sirach that we're listening to are 4 proverbs, again, kind of little sayings, which have a similar theme to those from one another. As the damned, as the damsel, now one remembers that Peter, you remember when he had been, Jesus had been arrested, had come to follow Jesus and had been sitting in the courtyard with the fire around it, and a damsel, a lady, a girl, had said to Peter, "Aren't you one of them?" "Surely," she said, "you are one of them, for your speech betrays you." So that's an interesting thought, and of course Peter said, no, no, no. But the point of the little proverb is that the way we speak, does tell us something about ourselves. How many of you, for example, may have traveled to other places and even New York City, and they would say, "Oh, we know you're from Buffalo," and you say, "Well, why?" "Because we don't have an accent." Well, there's a certain way in which we say certain words that are unique to our area. So words can have different slants depending on how we say them or who says them. So looking again now, so that's one of these little proverbs. Another proverbs, the calendar separates the grain from the chaff. Okay. Then another, the clay is fired in a kiln, K-I-L-N, kiln. And the fruit of the tree is known by its cultivation. And as I mentioned, speech betrays a person's character. So these four little proverbs really do the same thing, don't they? And I think reason why this is chosen to kind of mirror a little bit the sayings that are found in the gospel today. Speak well of no one, and I like this one. Speak well of no one until you are justified in doing so. I used to have a friend who would say, I thought you were smart until you started to talk. Well, maybe there is, and that's one of these proverbs here. Before you judge a person, don't judge by just looking at them or what they're wearing, but wait till they speak. Listen to what they have to say. And then you have, says this proverb, a basis for making a judgment. So in that way, these four little proverbs from the larger book of Sirach apply to a mirrored effect, rather, with the gospel. Finally, we have been looking over the last couple of weeks to this most important 15th chapter of Paul's letter to the Corinthians, in which he illustrates the importance of the resurrection. Now, again, as I've mentioned each time in this regard, keep in mind that Paul is what we would call a pioneer thinker here. He had begun this section by saying, remember, I hand on to you what has been handed on to me, that the Lord Jesus suffered, died, was buried, and raised from the dead. So the whole rest of the chapter then goes on to give an explanation or an understanding to those who question somewhat the resurrection of Jesus. And so in concluding this section, we hear these words. Death, and Paul here is pictured as saying this, death is swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? Now, what Paul does here, and this is something which modern interpreters of Scripture would caution us to do, is he takes a section from the prophet Hosea in which the prophet had said that God will destroy those in Israel who are deserting their belief in God. My eyes are closed to compassion, the prophet is pictured as saying. Well, now what Paul does is turn this around. He completely changes the meaning of the words of Hosea, and in verse 57 says this, but thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. So rather than seeing God as going to be doing something harmful to Israel for its failure to accept and believe in God as the only true God, Paul changes this around to say, yes, God has done something wonderful in Jesus, and because of that, the sting of death. Now, the little thought behind all of this is that somehow death has been caused by sin. And of course, the truth of the matter is, that may be a theological understanding that some of our thinkers throughout the centuries have kind of developed and wrestled with. But death is a reality of life that is due to all to all created things. There is nothing in creation that does not at some point die. Even mountains over a long period of time will disappear. But Paul's thinking here, picturing Jesus as saying, the sting of death is over, the permanency of death is destroyed. Who does a wonderful job of this in putting it into a song is in Handel's famous Messiah. In the latter part of this, there is a beautiful song, canticle in which he kind of takes these words and puts them into lyrics. So, what is the bottom or the conclusion? I was going to say bottom line, but the conclusion here of this little section of Paul: God will vanquish the forces of evil once and for all. He will be enthroned as conqueror on high, and in celebration will spread out a banquet for all the peoples of the earth to share. Interestingly, the glory and the gift of the resurrection is not just to some group, although believers certainly should move forward with this, but in a certain way, the victory of the Lord will swallow up death forever. And Jesus, and this is Paul's point here, is Jesus has accomplished this. So thanks to the gift of God, thanks to the actions of Jesus, his death, rising, his fidelity, the power of death has been destroyed forever for all. And for that reason, Paul encourages us, the hearers, to be firm, to stay steadfast in our belief, not to waver in our faith. And that can at times be a challenge. It might be important in noticing here that faith and doubt are not necessarily opposites. Sometimes we hear people say, oh, I doubt, well, there you don't have faith. Not really. Perhaps if we have true faith, then sometimes doubts come that invite us to consider different aspects of what we believe in a fuller and more complete way. So unlike some who say, well, you doubt, therefore you don't have faith. No, faith can encompass doubt, and sometimes, maybe, got to be careful here, but maybe sometimes those who believe and have no doubts are not quite as good in their belief, in their faith rather, as they might be. So the beautiful gift of God in raising Jesus from the dead, a gift that therefore is extended to all of us who believe, is of course a powerful, powerful and beautiful message that is brought to the fore here in this section of Paul's letter. So we have been listening, as I said, to this important section, and you might go back and look it over again sometime for your own study and reflection. Once again, we are left this week with reminders of Jesus. Let's all be careful about that log in my eye, the splinter only in, oh no, the splinter in your eye and the log in my eye. Let's be a little careful about removing it, and maybe we shouldn't be so worried about those things, but much more be ready to, as this section of Luke has pointed out, show love, forgiveness, and mercy, and be compassionate as the Father is compassionate as we can to others. Thank you very much, and hope to see you again.